The last time I heard his voice, he was laughing. He'd just finished work at the bar and said he was headed out for a solo hike in the Tetons before the next shift. I reminded him to bring extra water, and he teased me like always, "Mom, I'm not new at this." That was Tuesday, June 8th, 2021. He said he'd call that evening. He never did. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Marla O'Hare. I'm 51 years old, and I live just outside Syracuse, New York. I've worked as a pharmacy tech for over 20 years. Raised my son Caleb mostly on my own after his dad passed when he was in middle school. He was always outdoors, even as a little kid, climbing trees, fishing in creeks, sleeping with the windows open, no matter the weather. He moved to Wyoming in 2019. Jackson felt like a dream to him, snowboarding all winter, hiking in summer, bartending in between to make it work. He sent photos every week. Him standing at some ridge clouds behind him like something off a postcard. I missed him, of course, but I knew he was where he belonged. We still talked all the time. Video calls, texts, little updates about customers at the bar, or what he was cooking that night. There was a rhythm to our days, even across the country. And on that morning, June 8th, nothing seemed different. His last message was just a photo of his hiking boots and a line that said, "Looping up today? Delta looks good." I didn't think anything of it. Delta Lake. I'd seen pictures before, crystal blue water tucked between granite peaks, like something out of a dream. He'd hiked it before, but something about that day didn't settle right. Later, Max, Caleb's closest friend in Jackson, told me he hadn't brought much gear. Just a bottle of water, no backpack, no jacket. He was wearing a white shirt, those gold-rimmed sunglasses I'd mailed him the Christmas before, and that red watch he never took off. It didn't make sense. Caleb was always cautious on the trail. He'd once turned back halfway to Taggart just because the clouds looked off. He didn't mess around with weather, but that afternoon, for some reason, he went in light. At 2:15 p.m., park cameras picked up his car at the Moose entrance station. That was the last confirmed image of him. At 3:30, his phone pinged once off a tower near Teton Park Road. And after that, silence. Thursday came and went, and he didn't show up for work. By Friday night, Max started calling me. I missed the first one. When I called back and heard the panic in his voice, I knew before he even said the words, Caleb wasn't where he was supposed to be. And somewhere, in all that quiet between the trees, something had already gone wrong. The next morning, I called the park. Not the ranger station, but the main number listed for Grand Teton. I told them my son hadn't come home, hadn't shown up for work, and wasn't answering his phone. I tried to stay calm, gave them every detail. I had his name, the car he drove the trail, he mentioned the Apple Watch, the sunglasses. The man on the line said they'd flag it, said someone would check for his vehicle at the trailhead. I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there staring at my kitchen wall like it might blink back. By Saturday evening, I got the call. They'd found his car, a gray Subaru parked neatly in the Lupine Meadows lot. 5 days it had been sitting there. 5 days of storms and mountain winds and freezing nights. The keys weren't in the ignition, but nothing seemed disturbed. No backpack inside, no gear left on the seats. It was just still. Like he'd parked it for an afternoon hike and never came back. From there, things moved fast. By Sunday, Grand Teton had launched a formal search and rescue operation. I remember the woman on the phone saying it wasn't just a check-in, they were activating everything. Helicopter teams, K-9 units, dozens of rangers. They brought in Teton County's rescue team too, some of the best in the region. They flew grids across Garnet Canyon and Amphitheater Lake, combed the trails with heat-sensing drones, and rappelled down ridges most hikers would never go near. It sounded enormous, and it was. But I also knew what that meant. They don't throw all that at a case unless they think time is already running out. Max kept texting me updates, short-clipped messages. No sign yet, dogs working ridgeline. Weather moved in fast, team had to pull out. I could feel the edges of his panic in the way he wrote. Caleb wasn't just my son. He was Max's anchor. I think he believed deep down that Caleb would always come back. When they started posting flyers around Jackson, I saw the photo they chose. The one with him grinning at the camera, standing in the snow hair, tied back those gold-rimmed glasses crooked on his face. I hadn't taken that photo, but it felt like I had. I could hear his laugh in it. That's the thing they don't tell you, how photos hurt more than silence. The search crews focused on the terrain around Garnet Canyon and Delta Lake. That's what his phone and browser history suggested, and that's where most hikers went when starting from Lupine Meadows. The trail's not a gentle one. It rises fast, climbs hard. You don't go up there in a white t-shirt with no gear, unless you're cocky or careless, and Caleb wasn't either. Still, he'd done it before. Maybe he figured he'd be quick. Maybe he didn't plan to go all the way. Whatever his intention was, the mountains didn't leave clues. Not at first. There were no footprints, no broken twigs, no dropped water bottle. Just a vast expanse of stone pine and silence. The dogs caught no scent. The thermal imaging showed nothing. It was like he'd stepped off the trail and into the air. By Monday evening, the tone shifted. The updates got thinner. No one said it, but I could feel it. Hope was fraying at the edges. That's when a woman called in. Heather Michaels, 40 years old, a local from nearby Wilson. She told the rangers she'd seen a man that matched Caleb's description on the afternoon of June 8th, about half a mile from Lupine Meadows. She said she'd spoken with him, that he told her he was from out of state, living in Jackson, working at a bar downtown. Said he'd mentioned heading to Taggart Lake, that he planned to jump from a rock he liked there. The detail caught people's attention. The timing lined up more or less. The physical description was right, the white shirt, the sunglasses, even the tattoo on his forearm. For a moment, it seemed like something to hold on to. The park rerouted teams to Taggart and Bradley Lakes. I remember reading that and thinking, maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he never made it to Delta. Maybe he turned around and went the other way. It wasn't far-fetched. Caleb had done Taggart plenty of times. It's a shorter hike, less technical. You can swim there in early summer if the weather's good. They spent nearly a week shifting resources. Dogs, helicopters, foot teams. All based on what Heather said. And while they searched the southern trails, Garnet Canyon sat quiet. The clouds kept moving. The wind blew through the pines, and whatever truth the rocks held stayed buried. I couldn't shake the feeling something was wrong. Not just with Caleb being gone, but with the story itself. Something about the way Heather described that conversation didn't add up. It was too detailed, too rehearsed. Caleb wasn't unfriendly, but he didn't share his life with strangers on the trail. I knew that about him. And as more time passed, the cracks started showing. A local climbing guide came forward and said he'd seen someone matching Caleb's look near Garnet Canyon closer to 3:45 that same day. A different location. A different direction. It couldn't be both. The rangers began to pull back from Taggart. Quietly, at first. Then with more certainty. They stopped returning Heather's calls, and by the end of the week, they told me the truth. She'd made it up, every word. There had been no conversation, no sighting, no plan to jump into the lake. She said she'd done it to keep the search going. Thought if she gave them a lead, they wouldn't scale things back. I didn't know what to say. I still don't, but I remember sitting on my porch that evening, watching the trees sway in the wind, and realizing we'd just lost something we didn't have enough of already. Time. Valuable, irreplaceable time. And Caleb was still out there, somewhere, waiting for someone to start looking in the right place again. They never came out and said the search was winding down, but you could feel it in the air. The energy shifted. The daily updates from the park grew quieter, less frequent. One day, it was weather delays. The next, they were moving teams back to base. And soon after that, the calls just stopped coming altogether unless I reached out first. I tried to stay measured when I spoke to them. I didn't want to be the mother who cried on the phone or shouted or made demands. I knew how that could backfire. But deep down, I was starting to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. They were preparing to walk away. When I mentioned my concerns to one of the rangers I'd spoken to before he told me they'd exhausted the highest probability areas, he said they'd followed the evidence that they had to balance resources. It was the kind of answer that sounds reasonable on paper. But when your child is still out there somewhere possibly alive, possibly not, you don't hear reason. You hear retreat. Max was still hiking the trails after work, carrying printed flyers and posting them at backcountry points where traffic was light. He told me he'd spoken to a few climbers who thought they might have seen someone fitting Caleb's description, but no one could confirm it. One said he remembered a man with long hair and a white t-shirt near Surprise Lake. Another mentioned a tattoo possibly on the left arm, but no one could recall anything with certainty, and none of it came with photos or timestamps. I asked the sheriff's office if they'd be willing to reopen the search in the Garnet Canyon region, even just a limited team. The woman I spoke to was polite but firm. She said unless new verifiable information came in, there was nothing more they could do. If we hear something credible, she said, we'll act on it. And that word credible stuck with me. Because now everything was filtered through the lens of Heather Michaels. Her lie had done more than waste time. It had introduced doubt. It made every future sighting harder to trust. It made me harder to trust. That shift was subtle, but unmistakable. After her story collapsed, I could hear it in people's voices. They started treating my calls more cautiously, like I might be reaching again with some half-baked theory. At one point, a volunteer coordinator asked if I'd had trouble accepting ambiguous loss. I didn't know what that meant. I looked it up later. It's the kind of grief that doesn't have a body, doesn't have a grave, doesn't come with certainty. It's waiting for someone who might never return or might walk through your door tomorrow. The problem was, I wasn't imagining things. There were real inconsistencies in the case, gaps in the timeline that never fully lined up. Like why Caleb's phone pinged from Teton Park Road at 3:30 that afternoon, when if he'd gone directly up the Garnet Trail, he should have been deeper into the mountains by then. Or why his browser history pointed to Delta Lake, but no one ever found his name on any message board or local hiking group in the days leading up to it. Caleb usually checked in with a friend or coworker before long hikes. That Tuesday, there was nothing. And yet, when I voiced any of that, the conversations got shorter. I wasn't accusing anyone of negligence, I just wanted them to look again. In early July, I flew out to Wyoming myself. Max met me at the airport. He looked older than I remembered, more tired. He hugged me at baggage claim, but we didn't say much. That first night, we sat at a diner on the edge of town, both of us staring at the map spread across the table between coffee cups. He pointed to places he'd already gone. Garnet. Surprise. Amphitheater. I haven't made it up to the saddle yet, he said. Snow's still thick up there. We talked about Caleb like he was just behind the ridge, like we were going to find him waiting with a half smile and some excuse about getting turned around. But that kind of talk never lasted long. I spent the next 2 weeks hiking what I could. I'm not a mountaineer, and I wasn't trying to be. But I needed to see what he saw. I needed to walk those trails with his eyes. I carried flyers in my pack, talked to other hikers at junctions, and posted at the shelters. The response was polite, even warm. But no one knew anything. No one remembered him. I left a few flyers with a group of rangers at a seasonal post. One of them took it and nodded, said they'd keep an eye out, but he said it the way someone might when a conversation's over. By the time I flew home, I'd learned how quiet mountains can be, how they stretch on without apology, how quickly they stop giving up their secrets. I left Wyoming with more questions than I came with, and with a growing sense that the people meant to help me were already letting go. That was the part I hadn't prepared for. I always thought if something happened, if a child went missing in a national park with cameras and phones and witnesses, that the system would hold on. But what I saw was people turning inward, receding, hoping quietly that the file would close itself. When I landed back in Syracuse, there were messages waiting for me. One from a family friend in Vermont, another from a woman I didn't know. Someone who'd seen Caleb's case online and wanted to share a possible lead. She said she'd spotted a man near the Idaho border who looked like him. Long hair, pale shirt, traveling alone. I thanked her and I sent her photo to the sheriff's office. They told me they'd look into it, but I knew what that meant. There was no confirmation, no photo, just another story. And every time that happened, I could feel the same unspoken pause on the other end of the line, the part where they were wondering if this was real or just another Heather in the making. But I wasn't making things up. I wasn't chasing shadows. I just knew my son. And I knew something didn't sit right, not with his gear, not with the silence, and not with the way every trail they searched came up clean. You don't vanish without a trace, unless someone or something is helping you stay gone. I didn't have proof of that, not yet. But I had something else, a single small detail the rangers hadn't focused on yet. Something that hadn't seemed important at the time, but it would lead me to a place they hadn't searched, a place that didn't show up on their grids, a place that might have been missed not because it was hidden, but because no one had ever thought to look there at all. I didn't tell anyone right away about the thing that had been bothering me, not Max, not the ranger I was still checking in with once a week. But ever since I'd flown home, one detail had been playing over in my mind, quiet and persistent, like a low hum behind everything else. It was that final ping Caleb's phone logged at 3:30 p.m. on Teton Park Road. That didn't line up with the timeline they'd been building. If he entered through Moose at 2:15 and planned to hike toward Delta Lake from Lupine Meadows, he should have been heading into the canyon by 3:30, not lingering near the road. I looked at the map a dozen times, traced the distances, tried to factor in where cell signals might bounce from, but nothing settled cleanly. Every theory I came up with left something out. I didn't think it proved anything on its own. Phones lose signal all the time in the Tetons, but it stuck with me the way something sticks when it feels too specific to ignore. I started reading, not articles, but forums. Long threads written by hikers who knew the park inside out. Some had mapped out dead zones, others talked about signal delays and what towers might pick up a ping, even if the phone was deeper in the canyon. But most agreed that if his phone registered near the road at 3:30, it was likely because he hadn't yet made it into the deeper switchbacks. That meant he was still relatively close to the front of the trail, which didn't make sense if he'd entered at 2:15. Caleb was a fast hiker. He would have been much further in by then. I sent what I'd found to the ranger I'd spoken to the most, Tom Edwards' early 50s, quiet voice, careful with his words. He'd always been respectful, even after the department scaled back the search. He responded the next day, said it was possible given the way the mountains interfere with signal. He appreciated the thought. But I could tell from the tone that he didn't see it as a lead. Just a grieving mother turning over stones that didn't matter anymore. Still, I couldn't shake it. And the more I sat with it, the more I wondered if we'd all been assuming too much. Caleb had looked up Delta Lake before he left. That was on record. But what if he changed his mind after entering? What if something about the conditions, or even just a feeling, made him take a different route? I went back through everything I had. Every photo he'd sent me in the weeks before. There was one from early May, taken from a low ridge above the Bradley Lake Basin. Not a common angle. He'd written, "Found a side trail off the old horse line. Think it loops back to Taggart eventually." I remember thinking nothing of it at the time, but now I started wondering what trail he'd meant. Not all of them were marked. I emailed Max, told him I had a question about that photo. He responded a day later, said he remembered that hike. Caleb had taken it solo on a rest day, came back, saying he'd found an unofficial spur trail, one that looked old, mostly overgrown, but still passable. It wasn't listed on any of the visitor maps, but some locals knew about it. Max didn't know where it ended, just that it branched off south of the main loop. I asked if anyone ever checked it during the search. He wasn't sure. Said they might have, but he didn't remember hearing about it. He said he'd ask around. That was enough for me. I booked another ticket. Flew back out the following week, told Max I wasn't asking for a full hike, just a couple of hours to try and find that trailhead. We met early in the morning, just after sunrise, when the light was still soft across the ridgelines. The sky was clear, cool breeze coming in from the east. I had Caleb's photo printed and folded in my jacket pocket. We parked near the lupine lot and walked quietly for the first half hour, falling into the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. When we reached the point where the trail narrowed and the elevation started climbing, Max slowed. "I think this is where he veered off," he said, pointing to a patch of grass that didn't look like much. But when we stepped into it, I saw the shape of an old trail, faint but real. Bent saplings, a few scattered rocks lined in a way that suggested someone had once tried to guide foot traffic. Max hesitated, then said, "It's not park maintained. Not sure anyone's been back here since last year." We followed it for almost an hour. It curved south, cutting through a slope of loose shale and tall brush. Nothing about it felt dangerous, just quiet. We didn't find anything, no gear, no footprints, no scraps of clothing. But it confirmed something for me, that Caleb might have taken a route no one had thought to search. A route unlisted on the ranger's grids. I marked it on my own map and sent it to Tom Edwards when we got back to town. He wrote back saying he'd make a note of it, but there were no plans for renewed efforts at that time. Resources were limited, conditions were changing. I understood even if it hurt to hear. But that trip changed something for me. I stopped expecting the official channels to carry the weight of this. I realized that if anything more was going to be found, it would be through quiet persistence. Through paying attention to the gaps, not the headlines or statements, but the absences. What hadn't been asked, what hadn't been walked. I started reaching out to independent searchers, people who volunteered for cold cases, some with cadaver dogs, some just willing to put boots on the ground in hard-to-reach places. A few responded. One woman from Colorado, a retired K-9 handler from Idaho. They weren't promising anything, but they said they'd be willing to look once the snow started melting. Back home, I found myself listening differently to silence. The way wind moved through trees outside my window. The weight of the mail slot clapping shut with nothing inside it. I checked a trail app one morning and saw someone had logged a photo near Amphitheater Lake, tagged it 2 days earlier. The sky in the background looked familiar, almost identical to one Caleb had sent a year before. I don't know why I saved it. Maybe because it reminded me that the mountains were still there, still waiting, still hiding something they hadn't yet let go. And I couldn't explain it then, not fully. But something about that side trail, about the way it bent out of sight and wrapped along the edge of the basin, stayed with me. I had a feeling it wasn't just an old path, that it might have led him somewhere he didn't mean to go. Or maybe somewhere he did. Either way, I wasn't ready to stop walking. Not yet, not while the map still had blank corners. There's something quiet about handling your child's belongings after they've disappeared. It doesn't feel like mourning, not exactly. It's more like waiting in a room that used to be warm. I hadn't touched Caleb's things since the first time I'd visited Jackson. Not really. But that fall, as the weather began to shift again, and the first snow fell in the higher elevations, I found myself going through every image, every message, every item that might still carry some overlooked detail. I laid it all out in my dining room. Phone records, hiking maps, his work schedule, photos he'd posted, and then tucked into the corner of my inbox, something I hadn't remembered forwarding to myself, was the lost and found flyer the Rangers had circulated. I opened it out of habit. It listed everything Caleb had been wearing the day he disappeared. The white short-sleeve shirt, the gold-rimmed glasses, the red Apple Watch. But what stood out that morning wasn't the clothes. It was something in the item list I hadn't noticed before. A pendant. Silver U-shaped, small enough to wear tucked under a shirt. He'd worn it nearly every day gift from his father when he turned 15. And it was the only item on that list I hadn't asked anyone about directly. I reached out to Max and asked if Caleb had worn it that week. He said yes, he remembered seeing it at the bar the night before the hike, just barely visible under his shirt. So that meant he had it with him when he disappeared. I started searching again. Posts, photos, ranger reports. But no one had ever mentioned the pendant. It hadn't turned up in the search areas. And yet, it should have. A metal object like that, even small, might have reflected under drone footage or caught on something. But there was no trace. I don't know why that detail changed things for me, but it did. It pulled everything back into focus. I printed a separate flyer with just the pendant on it and mailed it to every ranger station around Grand Teton, including a few trailhead bulletin boards I'd never visited. A week later, I got a call from a seasonal ranger named Jess Claiborne, who was helping close down high country sites for winter. She said she hadn't seen the pendant, but she'd found something else unusual. While clearing debris near the edge of a runoff channel 2 miles south of Garnet Canyon, she'd come across what looked like a piece of torn cloth wedged under a boulder. It was white faded, maybe from sun or snow, or both. She didn't think much of it at the time, but after seeing the flyer and checking the date, she went back for a second look. She said the cloth had stitching along the seam flatlock like you'd find on athletic shirts. It was too degraded to tell much more. But it was something. The first something in months. I flew back out again for the third time since June. This time, I didn't ask for help. I didn't try to revive the full search. I just wanted to see the place Jess had described. She met me at a service lot just outside the park boundary. Tall, dark hair, tied back, calm voice. She'd already turned in her final report for the season, but she still carried the cloth sample in a sealed bag, like she couldn't quite let go of it yet. We hiked in slowly, not saying much. The trail was slick in parts, already crusted with frost from the night before. Jess led the way through a section of switchbacks, then cut across a low ridge down toward a gully lined with fallen logs. "This is where I found it," she said, crouching near a crevice at the edge of a granite slope. I stood still for a moment, just listening. There was a faint sound of meltwater moving somewhere under the rocks. One of those quiet mountain noises that's always present if you listen long enough. I looked around. The area didn't feel like a place someone would rest. There was no natural ledge, no tree cover. But it did feel like a place someone might end up if they'd slipped, or if they were trying to get off trail fast. I asked her if the location had been included in any of the official search maps. She said not directly. It was technically outside the original grid, close enough to overlap, but not a high probability zone. Too steep. Too dense with rockfall. She admitted she'd only checked it by chance while following a drainage line back toward the base of the canyon. That sat with me for a long time after. How many places like that existed, just feet beyond the boundary of where people had looked, just far enough to be forgotten? Back in town, I asked Max to help me cross-reference some of Caleb's older hikes, any photos he might have taken from that side of the ridge. We didn't find much, but there was one image he'd saved from a group trip the previous summer. It showed the ridgeline from the opposite angle, and in the corner, half shadowed behind the others, I saw it, Caleb's pendant. Just barely visible, hanging against his shirt. I zoomed in, trying to see the detail, but it was too grainy to tell much more. Still, it gave me an idea. I called Jess and asked her if she'd be willing to help log one final GPS point before she left Wyoming. Not for the ranger report, just for me. She agreed without hesitation. We marked the location where the cloth had been found. We circled the surrounding terrain, marking loose debris fields, tree cover, anything that might catch fabric or metal. I took notes on everything: elevation, time of day, light direction. I didn't know what it would lead to. Maybe nothing, but I needed to feel like I was still moving forward. After Jess left, I drove out to the edge of the park one last time and stood at the Lupine Meadows lot. The trailhead sign looked the same. The mountains looked the same. But the feeling was different now. It was quieter, colder. Less hopeful, maybe, but not empty. Because now there was something. A torn piece of cloth. A ranger who had looked twice. A stretch of rock just outside the grid. I wasn't ready to call it a lead, but it was more than I'd had before. And that night, just before heading back to the airport, I got an email. No subject line, just a single image attached. It had been sent by someone anonymous, no name, no message. The photo showed a shallow bend in a trail. Snow just starting to melt. And in the corner, half buried under runoff, was something small. Silver. crescent-shaped. I opened it, full screen, leaned in, and I couldn't say for certain, but it looked like the pendant. Caleb's pendant. The one no one had seen since June. I stared at it until the screen dimmed on its own. Then I turned off the lamp, sat back, and waited for the morning. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat at the edge of the bed, the photo open on my phone, the brightness turned down low. There was no metadata on the image, no date, no location tag, not even a sender name. But I kept going back to that glint of silver half submerged in runoff. The U-shaped curve was familiar. Caleb's pendant had been handmade a little asymmetrical on one side, where the metal dipped just slightly lower than the other. That same uneven bend was in the photo. I knew it wasn't proof of anything, not on its own. But it was something new, something no one had told me about. And the fact that it had shown up without a word made me feel two things at once: hope and warning. The next morning, I drove straight to the ranger office in Moose and asked for Tom Edwards. He was out on a backcountry patrol, so I sat in the lot for nearly an hour until he returned. When I showed him the photo, he held it in both hands and didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Where'd this come from?" I told him I didn't know. I explained the email, the lack of information, the absence of sender ID. He nodded slowly, then said, "I'll send it to our data team. See if anything matches terrain we've mapped." I thanked him, but I already knew what the result would be. The photo wasn't from one of their standard surveillance feeds. It wasn't from a search drone or a body cam. It had been taken by someone standing on that trail. Someone close enough to see the pendant clearly, but distant enough to leave no tracks behind. That was what kept me turning it over in my head. Not just where it was taken, but who took it. Back at the motel, I pulled out the map Jess had helped me mark up and tried to overlay the angle in the photo with the ridgelines we'd walked. If the pendant had really surfaced during the melt and someone had found it recently, then the photo was likely taken sometime between late September and early October, maybe even early November if the snow came late. But the creek beds near Garnet would have already started freezing by then. The image didn't show any frost, just water. That narrowed it, and it also meant someone had been out there after the official search ended in a part of the park that had mostly gone quiet for the season. I emailed Max and sent him the photo, asked if he recognized the trail bend. He didn't, but he offered to call a couple friends, local guides and off-season hikers who knew the less trafficked areas. I told him not to mention the pendant, just ask about the terrain. A few days later, he called me back. Said one of the guides, a man named Eric Toland, recognized the general contour of the slope in the photo. Eric had worked trails on the southwest side of Delta Basin for almost a decade. He told Max the image looked like it could have been taken near the junction of a seldom-used fire line, a narrow access route rangers occasionally use to navigate behind the basin in case of small flare-ups or rockfall closures. It wasn't marked on visitor maps and it hadn't been included in the main search zone. I met Eric that week, late 40s, quiet, observant. Wore an old canvas jacket with the park patch half faded off the sleeve. When I showed him the image in person, he pointed immediately to a notch in the background ridge. "That's slate rim," he said. "No question. And this line here, he traced with his finger. It's the lower fire cut. No one goes down there unless they know it." I asked if it was possible someone found the pendant and placed it there deliberately. He paused, then said, "I've seen weirder. You leave something small in the snowmelt, it can shift 20 feet or vanish altogether." But if that was found recently, whoever took this photo wasn't just passing through. They came looking. That was what I'd feared. The idea that someone had known where to look or what to show and chose not to say anything. I asked if the trail could be reached from any of the established routes. He nodded, said there were cut-ins from both the Southeast and the South Ridge Trail, but they were narrow, technical, and mostly overgrown. 2 days later, I went back out with Eric and Max. We packed light dressed for ice, brought backup gear. The air was sharp that morning, clear blue skies, cold wind off the canyon. We reached the first marker just before noon and found the old fire trail tucked behind a fallen stand of pine. From there, it was slow work. The slope was loose, full of broken shale and exposed roots. At one point, Max slipped on a patch of frost and had to catch himself on a tree limb. We moved carefully, scanning the edges of the runoff channels and brush. But we didn't find the pendant. The rock bed had shifted again since the photo. Snowmelt had widened the creek line and scattered debris across the bend. It was like searching through memory. Too many things changed, not enough left in place. Still, Eric marked the coordinates. He said he'd send the data to a friend at the Forest Service who occasionally monitored illegal hunting routes in the same area. I nodded, grateful, but I felt the silence closing in again. That feeling I'd come to recognize. The kind that came after each lead, each maybe. It always circled back to the same place. Caleb was still missing. And now, the search wasn't just about where he went. It was about who had been watching, who had walked into that same clearing, found something that belonged to my son, and chose to stay silent. That night, I sat in the motel again, the map open across the foot of the bed. I traced the ridgeline above the fire, cut with a pen, and marked a new circle just to the west where the runoff channel curved and narrowed. Something about that section felt wrong. Too close to the old route to be ignored, too far outside the grid to be routine. I kept staring at the contour lines, at the folds in the earth, and I wondered, had Caleb gotten turned around that day? Or had he followed someone I didn't know what I believed anymore? But I knew this wasn't over. Not with a pendant in a photo. Not with a silent ridge trail. And not with that feeling I couldn't quite shake that someone else had been on the mountain that day, walking just behind him, leaving no trace. A few days after that last hike, I got a call from a retired field investigator named Lyle Ransom. He'd worked cold cases out of Idaho Falls for almost 30 years before stepping away in 2018, and apparently someone from the local search and rescue group had passed along Caleb's file. Lyle said he wasn't part of any agency anymore, but he still kept tabs on missing persons cases that felt unfinished. He'd heard about the pendant photo and about the runoff trail near Slate Rim. He asked if we could meet, said he had a few questions that hadn't left him alone. We met at a diner just off Route 26, nothing fancy. He had a worn notebook, strong hands, and the kind of steady presence that only comes from spending too much time staring at empty folders. He didn't waste time. Did Caleb have any reason to be on that fire trail, he asked me? I told him no. Not that I knew of. And you said someone sent you that photo without comment? I nodded. Did you ever consider that the person who sent it wasn't trying to help? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both sat with the question for a moment. Lyle flipped open his notebook and slid a page across the table. It was a printed log of wilderness access permits. Some were guided trips, some independent. He'd requested old digital records from a few agencies that handled recreational traffic near the South Basin. One entry caught my eye. June 8th. 2 names, One was Caleb's, the other was someone I didn't recognize. Lyle pointed to it. I checked twice. That second name, Colby R. Larson, rented climbing equipment from a local outfitter that morning. Claimed he was headed toward Garnet, possibly Surprise Lake. Alone. I asked if the name had come up before. Lyle shook his head. Not in the official record, but that's not unusual. Names like his show up and disappear all the time, especially when nothing looks suspicious at first. Colby's file was thin. No criminal background, no missing persons in his past. But he'd bounced between Wyoming, Montana, and Utah for several years. Mostly seasonal work trail crews, backcountry cleanup, some guiding. Lyle said he wasn't making an accusation, just pointing to the first actual overlap he'd seen. Someone who had the means, the access, and the freedom to vanish unnoticed. What struck him wasn't that Colby had been in the area. It was that he'd never come forward, never said he saw anyone else that day. That he never once reached out even when the search hit the news. Most people who hike those trails and hear about a disappearance, even if they saw nothing, they check in. They confirm where they were. But this guy... nothing. Lyle paused. That's not guilt, but it's not nothing either. That night, I sat with the name, Colby R. Larson. It didn't feel familiar, but something about it sat uneasily in the back of my mind. I went back through Caleb's old messages, searched the name in emails and photos and old comments under his social media posts. I didn't find a match, but I did find a conversation, one I'd forgotten. It was a message Caleb sent me about a month before he disappeared. He'd been on a group hike and he mentioned someone new tagging along. Met a guy named Cole, he wrote. Kinda quiet. Knows the old ridge trails better than most locals. Says he works summers clearing out brush for the county. At the time, it hadn't registered. But now I wondered. Cole, Colby, could have been nothing. Could have been the same man. I sent the message to Lyle and he responded the next morning. Said it was worth looking into. He'd already started requesting employment records from the seasonal trail maintenance contracts issued that spring. A few were subcontracted through third parties, private firms hired by the Forest Service to maintain access trails and cut overgrowth. It was slow work, but by the end of the week, he found something. A name on a late May invoice. Colby Larson. Worked a 3-week job trimming routes in the lower Garnet Basin. No known address. Paid in full. No follow-up. The next step was obvious, but harder. We needed to find him. Not accuse. Not confront. Just ask. So Lyle started calling through a list of outfitters and gear shops, places Colby might have visited that summer, or in seasons past. And then, we got lucky. A shop clerk in Dubois remembered him. Said he'd come in late that fall, just before the first snow, looking for a used pack. Said he was quiet, but polite. Paid cash. Mentioned heading toward Oregon. That was the thread. We followed it across 2 counties, tracked credit card activity through a fuel stop in Boise, and eventually got a phone number linked to a prepaid account. Lyle tried it. Disconnected. But 2 weeks later, a new email showed up in my inbox. Different address. Same style. No subject line. No message body. Just another photo. This one was even harder to interpret. It showed the edge of a boot print, worn sole partial heel stamped into loose gravel. No landmarks. No date. Just a sliver of tread and the curved edge of a hiking pole imprint beside it. I forwarded it to Lyle. He zoomed in and checked the file properties. The metadata was stripped, same as before, but he noticed something. The angle of the sun, the light direction, it matched the slope where we'd marked the pendant trail 2 weeks earlier. He sent the image to Eric the guide. Eric confirmed it. The rock type, the grain, even the moss growth matched what he'd seen along the old fire cut. But there was one more thing, the tread pattern. It was an older Vibram sole used mostly on custom boots or repair jobs. Not standard issue. Not what Caleb had owned. So whose boot had left that mark, and why send it to me? That night I opened both photos again, the pendant and the boot print, and laid them side by side. There was no signature, no identifying mark, but the message felt clear. Someone had been there. And whoever it was, they wanted me to know. They'd seen something. Maybe even been a part of it. But they weren't saying why. Not yet. Lyle and I agreed we wouldn't go through official channels, not yet. The messages were too irregular, too ambiguous, and whoever was sending them clearly didn't want law enforcement involved. But after that second photo, the boot tread near the fire cut, Lyle started calling in quiet favors. He got in touch with an analyst he trusted, someone retired from search coordination in Helena. Her name was Dana. She didn't need a badge to pull data. Dana asked for everything we had: photo timestamps, metadata fragments, GPS approximations, even the weather patterns on the days the images were likely taken. A week later, she sent back her findings. The angle of sunlight in the boot print photo matched a 5-day window in late October. The tree shadows and melt rate in the pendant photo suggested mid to late September, which meant whoever was taking these pictures hadn't just stumbled into the area. They'd returned, at least twice, quietly, deliberately, possibly more. Around that same time, Max heard something that made both of us sit up straighter. A friend of his who worked nights at a gear co-op remembered a man coming in late one evening asking if the store carried older Vibram soles, the kind used on boots from 5 or 10 years ago. Max asked what he looked like. The man said he was quiet, mid-30s, dark jacket, no backpack, paid cash, no receipt. But here's what stuck out. He asked specifically about traction in loose gravel and freeze-thaw runoff. Not trail grip. Not inclined support. Just how to stay stable, moving down steep rock beds after melt. Most people don't phrase questions that way. Not unless they've walked those slopes before. Lyle was the one who finally said it out loud. We may be dealing with someone who didn't just find something. We may be dealing with someone who was there. I think I already knew that, but hearing it spoken took the wind out of me. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I was. For months, I'd held back, told myself, maybe it was just weather, or misjudgment, or poor timing. But this changed things. We weren't chasing silence anymore. We were chasing a presence, and we were being watched while we did it. That weekend, Lyle asked if I wanted to go back to the ridge one last time before the snow returned. He said if we waited, the terrain would ice over and stay frozen until spring. I didn't hesitate. Max joined us. We left early, no fanfare. Just 3 people walking into the stillness. We hiked past the same trailhead where Caleb's car had been found back in June. Same faded signs, same parking lines painted across cracked asphalt. It looked unchanged, but it wasn't. Not to me. The climb to the fire line was harder this time, more wind, less cover. There was snow at the edges, now brittle in places, holding just long enough before breaking underfoot. Lyle stopped halfway up a slope and crouched down. Here, he said. The indent was shallow but clear. Not a boot print, not recent. But something had been dragged through this pass. A series of small scrapes in the dirt, spaced like a weight had been pulled, not carried. It could have been anything. But the angle matched the same bend from the photo, and it led west, deeper into the ridge. We followed it for nearly half a mile. Then it disappeared into a crevice, steep, narrow, filled with rockfall that had likely shifted with the freeze. We paused there. No one said it, but we all felt it. That was where something had changed. Whether Caleb had fallen or turned or been followed, we didn't know. But the air held it, a kind of pause that didn't lift. Lyle marked the location. We stayed a while longer, walked slow, checked the brush, but nothing turned up. And just before turning back, Max stepped behind a tree line and called out. I reached him as he knelt near the roots. He was holding something in his glove. I thought it was nothing at first, just metal glinting in the pine needles. But when he turned it, I saw the edge of red, a curved band, aluminum or steel, bent, out of shape. The casing from a smartwatch. No screen, no strap, but unmistakable. We bagged it and brought it down the trail in silence. Lyle didn't say much, just nodded once and handed it to Dana when we returned. She took it home with her, said she'd run what she could. Maybe they'd get serial info. Maybe not. But to me, it didn't matter what the casing could still tell. It was the confirmation I'd waited almost a year for. Caleb had made it that far. His watch hadn't just gone dead from battery loss, it had broken. Which meant something had happened. And that someone, whoever had taken those photos, had seen the damage, maybe even caused it. 2 days later, a final message came in. This time, it wasn't a photo. It was just a line of text. No greeting, no name, just a sentence. The mountain keeps what it's owed. I read it 3 times, then showed it to Lyle. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. That's not random, he said. That's a choice. I asked what we were supposed to do with that. He said, sometimes people leave riddles to distract from what they've already done. I sat with that for a long time. There was no signature, no clue, just a strange kind of closure, someone trying to frame the silence like it had purpose. But I don't believe that. Mountains don't take. They don't owe. They don't choose who stays behind. People do. And one of them had been walking just behind my son that day, watching his steps, leaving none of their own. I never did find out who sent those messages. The photo of Caleb's pendant, the boot print, near the fire line, that final line about the mountain, they all stopped as quietly as they began. No return address, no pattern, just a silence that deepened once winter set in. Lyle followed what leads he could, but there was nothing concrete to act on. No confession, no witness, no trace of Colby Larson since that last blurry credit card transaction near the Idaho line. He might still be out there. Or he might have simply vanished into the same wilderness that took my son. I kept Caleb's photo on the fridge until the color began to fade. That was the one he'd sent me on a clear morning, 2 weeks before he disappeared, standing beside a ridge trail, grinning at the sky, that red watch, just barely visible on his wrist. Every now and then, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to send him a message. Something small, something normal. But I knew that rhythm had passed. What I had now were details, topography lines, drone grids, dates and coordinates and theories that don't quite hold up under daylight. But the shape of grief, I've learned, isn't built from answers. It's built from what you do next. I still hear from Max now and then. He stayed in Jackson for another year, then moved to Bozeman to work with a local rescue nonprofit. He checks in every few months, usually a photo of a trail or a weather update from the Tetons, or a memory that caught him off guard. We never talked long, but we never really stopped. Lyle retired for good the following spring. He told me once that some cases just stay open in your bones even after the files close. I understood that. There are things you carry because there's no one else left to. This past summer, I went back to Grand Teton. Not to search, just to walk. Just to stand where the trees thin out and the air lifts above the canyon. I brought one of Caleb's shirts, the same white one he wore that day. I folded it neatly and left it beneath a stone cairn on a ridge that faced west. He would have liked the view. Clean lines, quiet sky, a slow wind that never really stops moving. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't need to. Somewhere out there are still pieces of him. Maybe in the earth. Maybe in memory. Maybe in the way light bends over a trail no one's walked in years. I don't know if we'll ever have a name. But I do know this: Caleb didn't disappear. He was taken, and someone knows how. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll share it. So no path stays silent, and no name gets left behind.